Christian, if you're talking to us, you are on mute. We can't hear you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay. That took about twice as long as I thought, but I'm glad we got it going. Great to meet everybody. Hi, thanks for having Heirloom today to present. We are a California-based company with a headquarters in Brisbane, which is just south of San Francisco, and a facility that I'll explain a little more about today in the Central Valley in Tracy, California. By way of background, I'm on the commercialization team at Heirloom, looking after policy communications. Prior life to this, I was actually I'm from San Diego originally, so Californian, living in the Bay now. But prior to this, I was in the South Pacific for about 8 years and living in Fiji, tiny Pacific island country in the neighborhood of Australia and New Zealand. I was working for their former prime minister there, a guy named Frank Bainimarama, who was the president of COP23. So that the COPs of the United Nations climate negotiations were currently about 6 months out from COP29. So this was 6 COPs ago, and COP23, Fiji led those negotiations and helped kind of advance the global campaign against climate change. But now with Heirloom, very happy to be here. We're a direct air capture company. So we're removing carbon dioxide that's already present in the atmosphere, that's already swirling around the atmosphere, warming the planet. I want at the top kind of draw a distinction there. Direct air capture sounds similar to carbon capture, but quite different in practice. Carbon capture would be capping emissions at a point source. So you're having some source of emissions. You put technology on the top of that to stop those emissions from going into the atmosphere. Direct air capture, pulling down CO2 already present in the atmosphere and doesn't depend on new emissions. As for why we need to be doing this, I'll start with the kind of high-level science around what the climate science is telling us we need to be doing between now and mid-century and beyond in order to limit climate change. So actually, during my time in Fiji, the Pacific Island countries actually were the first to sign a multilateral agreement. 2015, they did it in Fiji's capital, Suva, to enshrine the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. I might be preaching to the choir for some folks who are already well familiar with this, but 1.5 degrees Celsius is relative to average global temperature in the pre-industrial age. So before people started emitting carbon to the atmosphere, and we've been tracking the average rise in global temperature from that point onwards. We're at about 1.3 degrees Celsius today. At 1.5 degrees Celsius and beyond, there's an existential risk to some of the lowest lying island nations in the world. Pacific Island leaders came together around the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. They took that mandate to Paris at COP21, and that became the aspiration of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, ratified by every nation. And in that agreement, there's an aspiration to limit average global temperature rise to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, with the goal of not having temperature rise go anywhere beyond 2 degrees Celsius. That was in 2015. In 2018, the UN's chief climate science body, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a report, a special report on 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, where they laid out basically every potential future left available to us in order to realize these temperature goals. And in every scenario, the path to 1.5 degrees Celsius and the path to 2 degrees Celsius requires 2 things. One, an immediate and steep reduction in carbon emissions, or all greenhouse gas emissions. That's called decarbonization. And in addition to that, so both and, the need to remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide that has already been emitted into the atmosphere. 2 trillion tons, or 2.5 trillion tons more like, that has been emitted since the industrial era until now. That CO2 is already in the atmosphere. It's going to stay there up to 1,000 years, contributing to the warming of the planet. We not only need to turn off the tap in terms of stopping the vast majority of emissions, we also need to start removing those emissions. Heirloom was founded 2 years after that IPCC report came out. It was initially a subject of The technology was a subject of PhD research out of the University of Pennsylvania. This group of folks here was initially taking a first principles approach to carbon dioxide removal. Basically looking at nature, looking at where carbon dioxide is stored in nature, and saying, how can we accelerate these natural processes that allow us to pull down CO2 from the atmosphere at the multi-billion ton scale that we need to by 2050. They looked at minerals initially, many of which hold carbon dioxide as a natural carbon reservoir, and they looked at limestone in particular. Our co-founder is on this screen, Dr. Noah McQueen, and I'll explain to you why the initial interest in combining direct air capture with what's called carbon mineralization, whereby you're accelerating the natural ability of minerals to pull down CO2 from the atmosphere, why that's where they focus their efforts. A few things: direct air capture is simply very difficult. There's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's very dilute relative to everything else that's up there. 200 parts per million in the industrial age, now up to 400 parts per million. Still very tiny. You need a sorbent that can bond to that CO2 in the atmosphere, and you need to scale up the production of that sorbent many times over in order to remove CO2 at the volumes we need to by mid-century. So you don't want to deal with a very expensive capture material, or one that doesn't have supply chains that exist today. But the benefits of direct air capture are that you can do this kind of service on a very small land footprint, that you can do it in a very verifiable way, so you can measure very precisely the amount of CO2 that you're pulling down. And you're doing it in a very additional way. This is CO2 that would never otherwise be pulled down from the atmosphere. Otherwise, it would just be, staying up there, warming the planet. By pulling it down, you're doing something that is truly additional, the way we think about it in the carbon removal world. It's not something that would happen on its own otherwise. So no creative accounting here. With the benefits of carbon mineralization are that you have an inexpensive natural capture material, which in Heirloom's instance is limestone. I'll get into exactly how that works a little later. But the difficulty of managing limestone in nature, obviously, is that you have unclear MRV. You're not exactly sure how much CO2 it's pulling down, and you need a ton of land to do it. So Heirloom, we're combining both of these benefits through a DAC mineralization hybrid technology. Okay. So why is limestone the right sorbent for us to be using? Limestone, or calcium carbonate, is composed of two molecules, carbon dioxide, calcium oxide. If you separate the carbon dioxide from the calcium oxide, you're left with lime. Lime is naturally thirsty for CO2 in the air around it. It wants to reform into limestone. If you spread it out on the desks in front of you, it would slowly start to bond to CO2 in the air around you and reform into limestone. The problem is that would take years. So Heirloom's process speeds that up to happen in just 3 days, and I'll walk you through exactly how we do that. So we start by separating the CO2 from the calcium oxide. We do that by heating up the limestone in an electric, renewably energy-powered kiln. That creates two outputs. One, a gaseous stream of carbon dioxide. Two, calcium oxide that naturally bonds to CO2, as I explained. Then we speed that bonding process up by laying the calcium oxide in a very precise layer on these trays that look like something you might bake cookies on. We stack them in very tall towers and expose the calcium oxide, which is treated with water, so it's actually calcium hydroxide, to the ambient air. And in 3 days in our process, that lime reforms into limestone using carbon dioxide from the air around it. And after that 3-day period is over, we take that calcium carbonate, that new limestone with atmospheric CO2, we stick it right back into the kiln, we heat it up, we separate that CO2 that was removed from the atmosphere, and we take that same lime, we stick it right back on the trays, and we loop the limestone through our facilities over and over again to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at scale. Right now, the question, if you want to, feel free to interrupt if anything's been confusing. I can't see everybody, but if somebody wants to play the role of moderator here, I'm happy to take questions. But the usual one we get at this point is, what do you do with the CO2?
There's a question.
I'm sorry. So you try to treat carbon dioxide by separating the CO2 from the limestone and then putting out the limestone so it'll re-attract the CO2 from the air. How do you dispose of the CO2 that you remove from the limestone?
Yeah,
I could think cycle to reduce the CO2 back in the air. I'm not saying you do that. How do you prevent that cycle?
absolutely. That's the natural question. That's what I'm about to get into is what do we do with that CO2 that we're capturing, including even the initial feedstock separation and then all the additional CO2 that we capture through the looping process. So Heirloom's business model is to permanently remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that it can't keep warming the planet. We're very clear about that commitment. It's not, we're not selling the CO2 to a soda company so that it can be re-emitted. And right now we are working in partnership with another company, a partner company called Carbon Cure. And we take that CO2, we inject it into the recycled water that's used to make concrete. And when you inject that water with CO2 in that mixture, it actually mineralizes. So it turns into a stone. It becomes part of the concrete that's produced, and that goes into Bay Area infrastructure. The benefit of that being is once the CO2 is mineralized, it's not going back into the atmosphere. Even if you were to demolish the infrastructure, the sidewalk or the bridge or whatever that's been made out of that concrete, that CO2 would just stay embedded amid the rubble. It's gone from the atmosphere into a permanent, useful product. And that satisfies our requirement to permanently keep it out of the atmosphere. That's what we're doing for now. Say again?
And it makes the concrete stronger, it benefits the concrete?
Yeah, it actually is. It's you actually use less material to make the concrete and it's a stronger product. It hardens faster and it's a stronger product.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Good. I got a good audience here that you're doing my presentation for me. So that's exactly right. Obviously, as we get to more serious volumes of CO2, this is what we're doing now at our facility in Tracy, California, which is actually the first commercial direct air capture facility in North America because it's the only one that's not only capturing the CO2 but permanently storing it away. And that's generating carbon removal credits that account for a net ton of CO2 that's removed from the atmosphere. And that's a very important point because obviously a facility like the one I've described that we're operating, it's built out of steel, concrete, plastic, takes emissions to build it, takes emissions to transport the CO2 to where it's mineralized in the concrete. For us to produce a carbon removal credit, that has to be a net ton of CO2 that's been removed from the atmosphere. So all the emissions associated with actually building the facility need to be removed again. So we need to remove all that CO2. And then in addition to that, remove net tons of CO2. And that constitutes a carbon removal credit for us. I mentioned earlier, we are storing right now in concrete. We actually pioneered that process with this company, Carbon Cure, in February of 2023 through the CO2 we were capturing at our pilot facility. And then we entered a commercial agreement to continue storing CO2 in that way when we opened our facility in Tracy in November of 2023. I mentioned we're selling carbon removal credits. Those credits are going to buyers in the voluntary market, all of whom have set ambitious net zero goals, some of whom have actually committed to not only reach net zero, but remove all the CO2 ever associated with running their businesses, including Microsoft, who's our largest customer. We have a deal with Microsoft to remove 315,000 metric tons of CO2 over a 10-plus year period. A lot of the facilities that will service the bulk of that agreement have not actually been built yet. This is a very interesting deal in that regard because it's the first bankable carbon removal deal. Anybody who's worked in the renewable power sector, renewable energy sector will be familiar with power purchase agreements. This is very much in that same vein where a customer is de-risking our facilities on the demand side by locking in specific volumes and prices over, in this case, a decade that allows us to lower our cost of capital to go out there and actually build those facilities. Speaking of those other facilities, right now we opened in November 2023, the first commercial direct air capture facility in North America. As I mentioned, we had Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, California Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, and some state and local leaders in Tracy for that opening. That facility is now removing CO2, storing it in concrete, as I mentioned. Our future facility, our next facility will be built in Louisiana, actually. We were the recipient of a direct air capture hub support through the bipartisan infrastructure law to build a 1 million ton removal facility in Louisiana with another partner company called Climeworks. So that'll pull down 1 million tons of CO2 from the air every year. That's the next big step for the business and be built with matched funding from the federal government. That's to service in part the Microsoft agreement that I mentioned earlier and We have several other buyers, including Meta, McKinsey, Stripe, Shopify, all in the voluntary market. I want to speak a bit about how we operate that facility, how it was built. I mentioned we're only in the business of permanently removing CO2 from the atmosphere. We don't sell our CO2 off to folks who in ways that it will be re-emitted. We also have a company commitment that no CO2 that we sell will ever be used for what's called enhanced oil recovery. If anybody's familiar with that practice, it's where you take CO2, you inject it underground into oil and gas wells. That pushes up fossil fuel reserves that can then be more easily extracted. We've made a commitment that our technology will never be used for that. It's very important that the technologies we're investing in now are scalable, that they have a path to doing this at much larger scales that are climate meaningful. The capture capacity of the facility we're operating in Tracy is 1,000 tons per year. It's an important first step. It's tiny relative to what the volumes of carbon dioxide that we're going to be needing to pull down as we look between now and the middle of the century. I said billions. I want to be really specific about that. I should have said this earlier. The IPCC requirement for carbon removal is 6 to 10 billion tons every year by 2050 onwards. So by using a low-cost input like limestone, which is not only cheap, it's very earth abundant. It's 4% of the Earth's crust. We believe we have a real path to getting to climate meaningful volumes of carbon removal. It's additional in the ways I named earlier, in that we're considering all the emissions associated with our process, removing against that, and then removing new tons of CO2. And that's when we're able to sell a carbon removal credit. It's highly measurable. We can measure very precisely each tray that's capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and measure very precisely how much CO2 is being injected and mineralized into the concrete. So there's a lot of, and that's actually done by a third party. So we are a supplier, we have a buyer. In between us sits an independent third party that verifies we're removing the CO2 that we say we're removing. Our buyers are very clear about that requirement. It's something we want to do anyways, especially if we're deploying in communities. I think folks generally want to know that the service of carbon removal that we say is happening is indeed happening. It's safe. Limestone, very well understood material, used in everything from chalk to toothpaste to concrete. When I describe the powder mixture, some folks, it's difficult when you're not actually in the facility seeing it yourself, but it sounds like a powder that's going on trays that might blow around on a windy day. Actually, the calcium hydroxide, once you treat it with water and it goes onto the trays, it's more of a crust. It actually looks kind of how most of us would envision limestone from the minute it's onto the trays. And we've done particulate matter modeling in the facility, and we're about 16 times under the Cal OSHA standard for particulate matter. And we also are, as we scale up this new kind of class of industry in California and around the US and around the world, want to make a really concerted effort to ensure that community benefits are coming out of these projects and facilities that don't just create jobs. We created 50 construction jobs building this facility, about 12 to 15 in operations on the day-to-day, all built with local union labor, which we're very proud of. But beyond the promise of jobs, we're also using this first facility as an opportunity to create a community governance model in Tracy and in the Delta region, working in partnership with local groups, community groups, environmental groups, to co-develop a multi-year community benefits fund that will distribute as we continue to operate the facility. And we like ending on this note, drive home the speed and urgency at which we've been moving at Heirloom. In July of 2021, we were capturing less than a kilogram of CO2 in a petri dish using limestone. And 27 months later, we opened the first commercial DAC facility in the United States for capturing 1,000 tons per year. We've been, it sounds like a simple process. It really is just rocks on trays. A lot of science and engineering behind it, but it's enabled us to move very quickly in a way that's very highly modular, repeatable, and can be done at a much larger scale. We need to keep moving at this speed if we're going to make a difference. Very much policy enabled as well. I mentioned we have support coming from the federal government. We've got demand in the voluntary market. More demand, increasing demand for this service is just the key to using markets to accelerate the deployment of this technology so that we can keep moving at this pace. That's pretty much all I've got. I kind of budgeted a fair amount of time for questions because there usually are. are a number. I'm happy to take any more you guys might have. I mentioned we're split between Brisbane, where I am right now, and Tracy, where I'll be tomorrow. Next up is Louisiana. But we're a California-grown company and always looking for opportunities to build partnerships here in the state as well.
The company that you're partnering with in Louisiana, are they also going to inject into concrete?
That's a good question. So I'll go back to this slide on where for future CO2 will be stored. Right now in this Tracy facility, we're using concrete. The plan in Louisiana is to inject the CO2 in what's called a Class 6 saline aquifer. So that's a well permitted by the Environmental Protection Agency, miles underground, where you'll then sequester carbon dioxide. It'll go into the well. This has been happening in the US for about 50 years through that process of enhanced oil recovery I named earlier. This won't be for that. It'll just be to permanently sequester the CO2. And the benchmark of CO2 storage is geologic storage. It persists for at least a period of 1,000 years, which is the lifetime CO2 would otherwise live in the atmosphere. Concrete is a really great pathway for us in the near term because it's immediately available. These Class 6 wells are steadily coming online as the EPA permits them in line with their standards, which are quite rigorous, and these things take some time. But the reality about the amount of sheer volume of CO2 we need to remove is if you do the back of the envelope sort of calculation, and you think about that 6 to 10 billion number or range that I named by 2050, all the concrete in the world, and we're going to be making a lot of concrete by 2050, can account for about 5% of that. So it's just, it's a good repository, but if we're talking about the sheer scale and volume of what needs to be removed from the atmosphere, it can't be the only one we rely on by mid-century. So the plan for Louisiana with that partner company, Climeworks, is to inject in a Class 6 well. The other repository for carbon dioxide storage is in basalt formations, which is happening right now in Iceland. Climeworks, there are 3 commercial direct air capture facilities in the world. One is in Tracy, the other 2 are in Iceland, both run by our partner company on that facility in Louisiana, Climeworks. They're mineralizing the CO2 they capture there in a basalt formation, where it basically, over a number of years, mineralizes into a part of the formation. The basalt reacts with the CO2 and becomes a stone as well. The EPA currently isn't permitting basalt formations for storage in the United States, only because they're focused on Class 6 for now. There's interesting research in the Pacific Northwest that's informing the EPA's next steps on that. But we're open to, as that kind of process evolves, looking at places with rich basalt formations in the US as a repository for CO2 as well.
Speaking of measurements, how do you do the counting for how many carbon emissions or save or sequester or whatnot? Do you do it internally? Do you have independent auditing or counting and climate accounting firms, or do you work in concert with, say, the EP?
So in between us, I think I understood the question, which is how do we verify the amount of CO2 that's actually removed?
That's right.
Yeah. So in between us as a supplier of carbon removal and a buyer, the companies I named earlier, sits what's called an MRV company. So that's a monitoring, reporting, and verification. It's kind of the holy trinity in carbon removal of these basically highly accountable frameworks by which the CO2 we're saying we're removing is assessed. The data they collect is actually, we haven't actually gone public with the company we're working with on that. We have an announcement on that, but the way it works is they'll have sensors within our facility, they do, that are assessing not only what we're injecting down in the concrete factory, but actually even at the point of capture and also at the point of injection. And they report that data to the buyer, who knows that they're getting the service they're paying for.
Are they an environmental equivalent of, let's say, an auditing firm or Coopers and Lybrand? Not literally Coopers and Lybrand.
I would actually go. I don't know that auditing is the right word. We call them MRV players because they're so actively ingrained in the process, right? They're not. It's not something we report that's then looked back on by this firm. They're actually the ones assessing it as it's happening and then reporting that information that we don't actually get a hand in to our buyers.
I see. Well, I mean, so
that's sorry.
Really auditing, maybe not the PricewaterhouseCoopers, but it really is a dependent auditing.
Sorry, could you say that? I think it might just be your distance from the mic. I couldn't quite hear you.
Well, I was praising the process. I said, it sounds like independent auditing, maybe not exactly like PricewaterhouseCoopers in financial auditing, but you do have a public auditing accounting process.
Yep.
Else? I think everyone's like mesmerized by all the content you just shared.
That's pretty cool. There was a lot to absorb this.
Yeah, it is pretty cool too.
I might stop the share if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Sorry, yeah, thanks. I'm glad. I hope that's the case. That everyone enjoyed it and learned something. It's I mean, the takeaway we hear quite often is just like, 1,000 tons today, billions of tons by 2050. We obviously have a very long way to go, right? These are very land efficient facilities. We definitely, we have a very clear internal strategy to get to that first billion tons. Accelerated by, limestone being super cheap and widely available. This technology, you kind of saw some images of it. When you're in the facility, you can really appreciate just how modular and repeatable the kind of iterations of this deployments can look like. Right now, we got trays of towers 40 feet high in the air. It kind of looks like you're walking into a giant bakery with nice wide lanes in between to have people walk through. As we build future facilities, these are going to be, at its start, twice as tall, the towers. The lanes are going to be closer together. We're just going to be increasingly efficient with the amount of removal we can do in a set piece of land. And we could remove 1 billion tons on a footprint the size of a couple Disney Worlds.
Wow.
And that's obviously one of several gigatons that need to be done. But that's the US, right? We can do that around the world, and in combination with other solutions, a lot of smart people trying different bites of the apple here. With the right kind of industry development, we'll get there.
How many people are employed in Tracy?
In Tracy, we've got 12 folks doing day-to-day operations of that facility.
It's also got robotic support, I guess I would say.
Yeah, so the trays are actually moved up and down by what's called a distributor. It's a machine that every 2 towers has got this kind of tray system that lives in between them that assesses how much CO2 they've taken in from the air around them, and also will actually spritz the trays with more water if need be, if it's not absorbing CO2 at the rate that we want. And when that lime has reformed into limestone, the distributor will take the tray, move it down to the bottom where it sits in a caddy, and then it'll get transported back to the kiln area where it's dumped of the limestone and refilled with lime, and then it goes back onto the towers. So that's automated.
So you're essentially harvesting limestone and then recreating limestone later, so there's not a lot of risk of running out, is sort of what I'm hearing.
We do loop the limestone, so it goes through over and over again. Eventually, we do think we haven't hit a limit yet on how many times we can cycle limestone through the facility. We're up to dozens of times. We think it would probably be at around 100, and then we would replace the material. Frankly, we wouldn't be at risk of overmining limestone even if we use new limestone for every single loop. It's just such a widely available material. If you do the math from like what we'll need of limestone to remove billions of tons, it's less than a sliver of a single percent. Just because it's such a commonly mined material. I think it's the second most mined mineral in the world. But we loop it. So yeah, we recycle it.
Can I ask a high level question? Are you working with either the EPA or other government agencies to establish standards or reporting or anything? So, I mean, you talked earlier about what I call about the MRV process with what I call, independence, agencies. Are you working at the government level as well to establish standards?
Absolutely. I mean, the sooner we get the government to set standards that are very high, the better. The DOE, America's made very clear they want to lead here, which is really, really welcome. The DOE has actually announced they're going to be one of the first governments in the world to buy these removals themselves. So rather than just set standards, they're going to set the standards and then purchase in line with those standards. Really important, really catalytic. not so much in terms of the volumes that they're buying, which are relatively small, but as a standard setting opportunity. Because, you know, the Microsofts of the world have a deep bench of folks working in diligence who can go through and vet these credits and make sure that these are reputable, worthy investments or worthy purchases to make. But not every company that wants to buy these removals has that kind of bench. But when the DOE, the US government, comes in and buys a portfolio of different carbon removal options, that's a validating stamp of approval to say that these are high quality credits. These folks are doing what they're saying they're doing. And that allows a lot of other folks who are sitting on the sidelines to make a decision to buy high quality removal. So absolutely. I mean, that's government's acting as the standard setter here. Right now it's in the voluntary market. The sooner the government, you know, not only sets standards, but actually makes this a requirement that if you're polluting or you're emitting carbon into the atmosphere, by the time we say we're hitting net zero, you need to remove that CO2, is hugely important.
Speaking of the DOE, this is a presidential election year with two rather different election scenarios. Does it make a difference to you which scenario obtains, or is a situation where the government administration basically calls the shots and who then the president's more of a figurehead?
That's a good question. We think about that a lot. We got our funding for that direct air capture hub in Louisiana from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there is a lot of bipartisan support for this as a climate solution comparatively. Number one, we're building in a red state, million-ton facility. It's going to create thousands of jobs. Two, this service, the kind of jobs it creates, especially on the sequestration side, I was talking about injecting the CO2 into class 6 saline aquifers. If you are working traditionally in the oil and gas industry, you are that expertise of sequestration lives singularly with that workforce. So it's one thing to go from an oil and gas job to installing solar, right? You might have to go back to school to do that. It's actually very much not the same thing. But with CO2 sequestration, not only are they already doing CO2 sequestration, but the chances are if you're good at extracting CO2, you can repurpose your skills to sequester CO2. And a lot of folks understand that. And if there is such thing as a just transition, which is a term I've never really liked, this is it. Direct air capture jobs, especially in areas like Louisiana that have traditionally relied on oil and gas jobs, can start doing this as a climate solution. And when you're able to broach the subject like that, to say, we're coming, we're going to be building this facility, it's going to create this many jobs in your community, nobody needs to go back to school to do it, you get a lot of support. 45Q as well, one of the tax incentives. So we get an investment tax credit right now from the US government for every 1 ton of CO2 you permanently sequester, you get a $180 tax credit. That was introduced by a Republican during the Bush administration. Folks on that end are definitely understand how this can really economically empower regions of the country that have traditionally relied on oil and gas to do something that is, you know, beneficial to the climate that needs to be a part of the solution. So we're really blessed with a lot of bipartisan support, and we do a lot to continue to cultivate it and make sure this is something that it gets really enduring bipartisan support moving forward.
So right now you're able to inject this into concrete. Can it be injected into similar product like asphalt? Or is it that you have a company that knows how to inject it and they happen to make concrete?
Unfortunately, the list of useful CO2 sequestering products like concrete it's a fairly short list. Asphalt, I'd be happy to be taking to school on this. I think it's just a ground up mineral. I think it's just what olivine or basalts. So we wouldn't be able to inject CO2 in it. I think concrete, because anything that required CO2 before the need for this service, we'll probably be able to inject in. I mean, you could technically make diamonds out of CO2, right? That would be a long-lived product. But right now, the options for storage are for permanent storage that really stops it from warming the atmosphere over a long period of time are pretty much limited to what I laid out: concrete, class 6 wells, basalt formations.
I know of an organization, a company, it's a worldwide company. They do road work infrastructure all around the world. So pavement as well as asphalt, concrete, they're in all lanes of that.
Oh, cool.
room for what you do to work with another company if they build the ability to inject, or does it all have to go through the company you're working with?
So actually, the partner company I mentioned is kind of like the sequesterer. They also work with another concrete manufacturer. So there are actually 3 companies in that value chain, and that third player, who's just a concrete manufacturer, could be subbed in and out for. We've worked with already 2 partners on that already. I think Central Concrete and Granite Rock. So if there's any, I don't know if those are either of those are the companies, but that third player just needs to be somebody who makes concrete. So I'm more than happy to be connected with somebody who's in that space that you might know.
Share your recording with them and see what they think.
Okay, great.
Any thoughts?
I forgot I was being recorded.
Is that okay?
No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
Our norm is to take that and render it up to our YouTube channel, and it goes on our website, so it lives there for people that want to refer back. Awesome. We also share back to you if you'd like it.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Sharon, if you'd like to share it. Awesome. Anything else, guys?
It just struck me as so strange that we've got Iceland and then we've got trees.
Yeah.
Location. I don't know how that came about, but it was just something that stood out.
Would it be geology perhaps? Common geology?
Did you understand the question? She's like,
Yeah. I think so. In terms of deploying the solution, CO2 removed from the atmosphere anywhere is CO2 removed everywhere. The CO2 is just swirling around the atmosphere. You can do the service anywhere with the same impact in terms of the climate math being made to work. So we obviously Bay Area based, we saw it as an opportunity to kind of bring Silicon Valley tech to the Central Valley in a very cool way. You can still build things in the Central Valley, which is great. that was helped pull us out there, and it was still near enough to home. Really, the siting considerations that have impacted us the most, and I do have to drop after this. I've got a 12:45, but the siting considerations we think about the most are workforce, folks who can, have. We love working with local union labor, plumbers and pipe fitters in Tracy who could build this. And as we go down the line in terms of sequestration expertise, that's hugely valuable to us. Availability of renewable power. I mentioned we run the entire facility on renewable energy. We like to be a catalytic customer, not only use renewable energy, but pay a premium to build new renewable energy assets that go into the grid. So areas where we have line of sight to those new renewable energy assets that we can continue to rely on to power the process. Very important because we need 100% green electrons. And we tend to actually like humidity. It's not make or break, but we like humidity. And for our technology, because we treat the trays with water, actually, when there's more humidity in the air, the trays can
self-absorbed.
The material can actually pull water from the air, and that reduces the amount of water we need to use. And wind flow, right? We like we don't need a giant vacuum like other technologies have used to pull CO2 through this kind of system and use a lot of energy doing so. But we like wind because it keeps fresh CO2 blowing over the trays.
Makes sense. Well, I understand you are at time. We really appreciate this. This is something completely new, I think, to most everyone in the room. I think that's where some of the silence is. It's like, wow, that's a lot to get your head around, but fascinating information. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today. Thank you, Jolene, for connecting us. We'll hopefully be in touch again.
I really appreciate you guys inviting us to present. If there's any other questions, I'm sorry if we missed anything. Feel free to send them to me, and we'll be happy to take a pass at them.
All right, thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, guys.
Everybody.
And you.